At 3:42 local time, 4 EH-47 Chinooks crossed into Iranian airspace 11 kilometers southeast of Bandar-e-Lenge, flying nap of the Earth through a mountain corridor at 8,400 feet above sea level. The insertion point lay 43 minutes ahead. The nearest diversion airfield was now beyond fuel range. Abort authority still existed on paper. In practice, the decision had already been made. Inside the lead aircraft, a Ranger element sat in silence. They had been briefed on an objective they had not yet seen. The mission order was precise: verify, contain, extract. The time window, 45 minutes from boots on ground to final exfiltration, was not negotiable. It was derived from fuel endurance, political exposure tolerance, and the estimated interval before Iranian quick reaction forces could mobilize from garrisons 60 kilometers west. The facility they were approaching had been carved into a limestone ridge during the previous decade. Its exact function remained debated. For years, it had been assessed as a hardened communications relay and storage node, valuable but not decisive. That assessment rested on continuity. Continuity had broken. 3 days earlier, a signals intercept captured a directive referencing transfer authority, not deployment, not activation, transfer. The language was narrow enough to mean everything or nothing. Competing interpretations formed within hours. One camp argued bureaucratic reshuffling. Another flagged escalation. Neither could confirm what the facility now contained. The margin for error collapsed. At 3:51, the lead aircraft received a coded transmission from an airborne command element operating over the Gulf of Oman. The message contained no new intelligence. It confirmed what the crews already understood. External monitoring had detected the incursion. Regional air defense networks were beginning to react. Classification of the operation as routine had failed. 40 seconds later, the first open-source report appeared on a regional monitoring platform. The language was fragmentary, but directional. Unidentified rotary wing movement near restricted zone. Within 6 minutes, the phrasing had shifted. U.S. asset penetration confirmed. By the time the Rangers reached the insertion corridor, the narrative had hardened into something neither Washington nor Tehran had authorized. U.S. Army Rangers storm Iranian mountain base. The operation had not yet begun. The interpretation had already escaped control. If you recognize the margin between decision and perception, subscribe. These moments don't announce themselves in advance. If this matters to you, leave that below. And if you're still tracking, at this exact point, knowing what you know now, would you have halted or committed? The facility sat at the head of a dead-end valley, shielded by terrain on 3 sides. No roads led directly to the entrance. Access required either vertical insertion or a multi-hour approach march through monitored terrain. The Rangers had neither the time nor the operational security for the latter. Insertion would be contested by geography, not fire, at first. The clock started the moment the first boots touched rock. The objective was singular. Confirm the presence or absence of materials that, if operationalized, would alter the strategic calculus of the region within 72 hours. There was no secondary win, no intelligence bonus, no capture priority that mattered unless the primary question was answered. Success was binary. The first constraint was vertical. The facility's main entrance sat 340 meters above the valley floor, accessible only by a switchback service road designed to slow vehicles and expose approaches. Helicopter insertion at the entrance itself would bracket the element against sheer rock with no maneuver space. The alternative? Fast rope onto a ridgeline platform 60 meters above the entrance. Bought concealment at the cost of time. The Rangers chose time. The second constraint was depth. Interior imagery did not exist. The best available schematic had been derived from construction manifests intercepted 4 years prior. Cross-referenced with seismic profiling and energy consumption patterns. It suggested a primary corridor extending 180 meters into the mountain, branching into at least 3 hardened chambers. If the facility had been modified since, the schematic was fiction. The third constraint was detection. The operation existed in a narrow band between stealth and escalation. Suppressed fire was authorized. Demolition was not. Communications intercept would occur the moment Iranian military frequencies registered anomalous silence from the facility's security detachment. That silence would prompt inquiry within 12 minutes, mobilization within 30. The 45-minute window assumed the facility's garrison would not immediately understand what was happening. It assumed no external reinforcement existed within reaction range. It assumed the Rangers could move faster than confusion could clarify into resistance. All 3 assumptions were dependencies, not certainties. The fourth constraint was extraction. The MH-47S could not loiter. Fuel, exposure, and air defense overlap meant the aircraft would depart the insertion point, reposition to a holding area 22 kilometers south, and return on schedule. If the ground element missed the extraction window, the next viable pickup occurred 90 minutes later, long after Iranian forces would have secured the valley. Missing extraction was not contingency planned. It was mission failure. The asymmetry was clear. The Rangers brought precision, rehearsed violence, and a countdown. The facility brought depth, hardened construction, and the political weight of sovereignty. In a protracted engagement, depth wins. The mission relied on the facility never realizing it had time to use that advantage. But one assumption, quiet, embedded in the operational math, had not been stressed during final mission brief. The assumption was that the facility's purpose had remained static. If that assumption failed, everything else became irrelevant. The flaw was not in what intelligence had found. It was in what intelligence had stopped looking for. For 18 months, collection against the facility had focused on external indicators: convoy frequency, power consumption, communications discipline. The pattern had been stable. Stable targets generate less scrutiny. Your less scrutiny creates gaps. The gap was this: no one had questioned whether stability was organic or performed. At 1:15 Zulu, 90 minutes before the Rangers crossed the border, a late-breaking update reached the task force command element. The update originated from a human source with inconsistent reliability. The source reported that within the previous 72 hours, a technical team not affiliated with the Iranian military had been granted temporary access to the facility. The team's identity was unclear. Their purpose was not specified, but their presence fundamentally altered the operation's risk profile. What had been a state-to-state calculus now carried third-party entanglement. Capture, confrontation, or exposure could cascade beyond bilateral containment. The mission's authorization had been premised on manageable escalation. That premise no longer held cleanly. The update arrived too late to abort, without loss of strategic position. It arrived early enough to tighten the rules of engagement into something nearly unworkable. This was plot twist number 1. The facility was not exclusively under Iranian control. It had become a shared access node. The Rangers were no longer entering a denied military site. They were entering a political tripwire. The objective did not change. The cost of error did. Planners adapted in real time. The assault element was divided into 3 units. Threshold unit, 4 Rangers tasked with securing the entrance and establishing a hardpoint. Their role was to prevent external reinforcement and maintain the extraction corridor. If the entrance fell, nigh the entire element would be trapped inside the mountain. Reconnaissance unit, 6 Rangers tasked with forward clearance of the primary corridor. They would move ahead of the main effort, identifying obstacles, mapping live resistance, and locating the objective chamber. Speed mattered more than stealth. The corridor was linear. There would be no flanking. Exploitation unit, 8 Rangers tasked with entering the objective chamber confirming or denying the presence of materials, and securing evidence for later assessment. This unit carried the technical equipment required to verify what intelligence could only infer. No unit could succeed independently. Loss of any one component meant mission failure. The interdependence was doctrinal, but it was also psychological. It distributed the weight of the decision across multiple actors, reducing individual hesitation while preserving collective discipline. As final checks concluded, one more detail surfaced. The facility's garrison was smaller than expected. Iranian defense doctrine for hardened sites emphasized layered security. This site showed minimal external presence. Either the facility had been deemed low priority, or its protection relied on something other than visible force. The second interpretation suggested a bluff, that exposure alone would trigger consequences too severe to risk, that the garrison's role was not to repel intrusion, but to ensure intrusion never occurred unnoticed. If true, the Rangers' advantage was narrow. Silence bought time, but only until the first alert reached a decision-maker capable of understanding what silence meant. The clock had not yet started. The margin was already closing. 0358, local/0028 Zulu. Insertion. The first Ranger hit the ridgeline platform and immediately moved to a firing position covering the access road below. No visible movement. No audible response. The second and third Rangers fast-roped without incident. By the time the fourth boots touched stone, the Chinook was already pulling away. Rotor wash, scattering loose rock across the slope. The insertion had been clean. Clean meant only that it had not yet failed. Threshold unit moved downslope toward the facility entrance, 60 meters below. The entrance was a reinforced steel blast door set into the rock face, flanked by two observation positions built into recessed alcoves. No personnel were visible. The positions were manned. Heat signatures confirmed that. But the garrison had not yet reacted. Either they had not detected the insertion, or they were waiting. 402 local. Entry. The blast door was not locked. It was ajar. That was the first deviation from expectation. Threshold unit held position, covering angles while reconnaissance unit moved through the entrance into the primary corridor. The interior was lit by overhead industrial fixtures, spaced at irregular intervals. The air was cool, dry, and still. No active ventilation. The corridor extended forward into darkness. The schematic suggested 180 meters. The schematic had already proven incomplete. 405 local. First contact reconnaissance unit moved 40 meters into the corridor before encountering resistance. Two armed personnel emerged from a side passage. They did not immediately fire. They appeared to be repositioning, not engaging. Suppressed fire from the lead ranger dropped both targets within 3 seconds. The sound was absorbed by stone and distance. No alarms triggered. Silence remained intact. But the encounter introduced a new variable. The personnel were not in standard Iranian military uniform. Their equipment was commercial grade, not military issue. This aligned with the late intelligence update. Non-state presence confirmed. The cost of that confirmation would not be known until later. 0409 local. Late intelligence. A transmission reached the task force command element from an intelligence node monitoring Iranian communications. The message was brief, unverified, and catastrophic in implication. The facility's primary purpose had shifted within the previous 48 hours. Materials had not been moved outward for deployment. They had been consolidated inward for secure handoff. If accurate, the facility was now a transfer point, not a storage node. The 45-minute window had been calculated against a static target. It was now operating against a dynamic exchange that may have already concluded. The update could not be confirmed without compromising sources. It could not be ignored without risking the mission's entire premise. A decision was required. The ground force commander, operating from a forward tactical operations center aboard one of the repositioned Chinooks, faced a choice with no clean resolution. Abort would preserve operational security, but leave the strategic question unanswered. Proceed risked committing force to an objective that no longer existed. The commander chose to proceed, not because certainty existed, but because uncertainty had become the only constant. This was plot twist number 2. 0414 local. Objective chamber located exploitation unit reached the end of the primary corridor. A secondary blast door blocked further progress. Unlike the entrance, this door was sealed. Thermal imaging showed no heat signatures on the far side. Breaching would take 4 minutes. It would not be silent. The unit leader authorized breach. At 4:18, the door failed. The exploitation unit moved through into a reinforced chamber approximately 12 meters square. The space contained modular storage units, environmental control equipment, and a workstation displaying inactive monitoring screens. It did not contain personnel. It did not contain active materials. What it contained was documentation, transfer logs, authentication records, and timestamps indicating a handoff had occurred 31 hours prior. The materials had already left the facility. 4:22 local. Extraction window opens. The primary objective, confirmation, had been achieved. The answer was not what planners had hoped for, but it was definitive. The ground force commander issued the extraction order. Reconnaissance and exploitation units began retrograde movement toward the entrance. Threshold unit maintained security at the blast door, scanning for external response. None came. The garrison had either withdrawn or chosen not to engage. The silence that had protected the Rangers now concealed something else. At 4:29, Iranian military frequencies registered the first alert. A facility check-in had been missed. Inquiry protocols initiated. Quick reaction forces were placed on standby. No, the Rangers cleared the entrance at 4:34. The Chinooks were inbound, 3 minutes out. By 4:37, all personnel were aboard. The aircraft climbed out of the valley, retracing the ingress corridor in reverse. At 4:43, 45 minutes after the first boots touched the ridgeline, the element was clear of Iranian airspace. Was this restraint under pressure or miscalculation masked by luck? If you're still weighing that, say so below. The return flight carried the same risk as entry, compressed and reversed. Detection was no longer hypothetical. Iranian air defense networks were active. Regional monitoring platforms had locked onto the flight path, but response did not materialize. Either the decision to engage had not been made, or it had been made and withheld. Both interpretations carried consequences. By 5:10 local, the Ranger element had reached friendly airspace. No aircraft had been fired upon. No personnel had been lost. The mission, measured by execution, had been clean. Measured by outcome, it had arrived too late. Within 6 hours, the operation's existence was no longer deniable. Open-source intelligence platforms published imagery of rotor wash patterns on the ridgeline. Regional media carried statements from Iranian officials condemning an incursion. Washington issued no confirmation, no denial. The narrative that formed in the absence of official clarity became the record. U.S. Army Rangers storm Iranian mountain base. 45 minutes of brutal combat. The description was not accurate. It was not entirely false either. Combat had occurred. The duration had been 45 minutes. The brutality was a matter of perspective. What the narrative omitted was more significant than what it included. It omitted that the objective had already been moved. It omitted that the Rangers encountered minimal resistance because resistance had been strategically avoided. It omitted that the mission succeeded in answering a question, but failed to prevent the outcome that question had warned against. Internally, the operation generated more questions than it resolved. Why had the garrison not engaged more aggressively? Why had the blast door been left ajar? Why had the non-state technical team been granted access in the first place? One interpretation suggested the facility had been a decoy, valuable enough to defend passively, expendable enough to sacrifice if pressed. Another interpretation suggested the Iranians had understood the incursion in real time, and calculated the cost of confrontation and chosen operational ambiguity over tactical victory. Both interpretations implied the same thing. The 45-minute window had never been about time. It had been about threshold, and the threshold had been crossed by both sides without either choosing to escalate beyond recovery. In the weeks that followed, policy adjustments occurred quietly. Authorization thresholds for cross-border operations tightened. Intelligence collection priorities shifted toward tracking mobile transfers rather than static facilities. Diplomatic channels which had gone silent before the operation resumed, but the terms of conversation had changed. The mission did not start a war. It clarified how close the margin had become. If this happens again, the signs will not be louder. They will be quieter. If you want to recognize them, you'll need to be here. Subscribe if that matters. The Rangers who flew into that mountain corridor did not know whether the operation had succeeded or failed. They knew only that they had been asked a question that required entering a sovereign nation's hardened facility, confirming what was no longer there, and withdrawing before the cost of that confirmation exceeded its value. They had done what was ordered. Whether it was the right order remained unresolved. That ambiguity was not a flaw in the mission. It was the mission.